On the day Natalie Wood died, the public received an answer. But not everyone believed it was the final one. In the decades that followed, the Hollywood star's death continued to linger like a huge question mark behind the glamour of the American entertainment industry. Every time the case was brought up again, details that seemed to have been forgotten would resurface and spark new controversies. What made the story so special was not just Natalie Wood's fame. On that boat that night, there were no cameras recording the events and no independent witnesses who saw her final hours before she disappeared. And over time, those very accounts began to show cracks. Then, after more than 4 decades, Robert Wagner finally broke his silence. In rare conversations during his later years, he publicly looked back for the first time at the fateful night on the waters off Catalina and offered his own explanation of what had happened. So, in the end, over the past 40 years, what exactly had Robert Wagner been hiding? I knew a storm was coming, but I still let the boat leave the dock. In the final years of his life, during a filmed interview, Robert Wagner appeared before the camera with a rarely seen quiet demeanor. Behind him was a slightly open window where the fading afternoon light filtered in, casting a glow on a face deeply etched with the marks of age. For many minutes, he said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on his hands, which were trembling slightly on his knees. Then finally, in a hoarse and deliberately slow voice, as if confronting memories he could no longer escape, he spoke. "I knew a storm was coming, but I still agreed to let everyone set sail." Silence enveloped the studio. No one spoke because everyone understood that what Wagner was referring to was not merely the storm that appeared on the Pacific Ocean on November 27, 1981. It was also the incident that had swept away nearly his entire life, along with the woman he loved more than anyone else, Natalie Wood. Dennis Davern, the captain who had been by Wagner's side for many years, once brought the weather warning report and placed it in front of him. He clearly stated that the conditions at the time were not suitable for departure. Wagner did not reply immediately. After a few seconds of thought, he only said softly, "Just go. I need some time to myself." But those who truly understood Robert Wagner knew he was not really seeking solitude or peace. What he wanted to face was the emotions quietly eating away at him from within. A few weeks earlier, Hollywood had been filled with chatter surrounding Natalie Wood and Christopher Walken, her co-star during the filming of Brainstorm in North Carolina. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner published a photo capturing the moment Walken placed his hand on Natalie's shoulder at a cast party. The accompanying caption was short but full of implication. Sometimes one look can say 1,000 words. Not stopping there, People magazine further heated up the story by observing that between Wood and Walken, there existed a connection that was hard to describe, one that carried both an artistic quality and something fraught with risk. Just days later, those articles and images covered newsstands from Beverly Hills all the way to New York. And once again, Robert Wagner found himself cast in a real-life role, the husband facing challenges from Hollywood's glamorous world. In the eyes of the public, they had once been one of the iconic couples in American cinema. They married in 1957, separated in 1962, and then unexpectedly reunited with another wedding in 1972. After 10 years apart, they returned to each other under the flashing lights of countless photographers. Vanity Fair once called them a softer, less turbulent version of Liz Taylor and Richard Burton. But beneath that perfect exterior, cracks had existed for a long time. In a Hollywood still heavily influenced by patriarchal thinking, feelings of jealousy quietly grew within Wagner like a smoldering fire that never went out. In the early 1980s, his career was no longer at its peak as before. Meanwhile, Natalie Wood was preparing to mark her return to the screen after a period focused on family. The invitation to join Brainstorm from director Douglas Trumbull filled her with great excitement. And Christopher Walken, who had won an Oscar for The Deer Hunter in 1978, possessed a cool charm and the ability to make the person opposite him feel truly listened to and understood. During their time working in North Carolina, Natalie and Wagner frequently had lunch together. They talked about art, fame, and the sacrifices that came with celebrity. One crew member later recalled, "The way Wagner looked at Natalie was the kind of look that would make any husband feel uncomfortable. Everything truly exploded when David Wallace, a reporter for The Hollywood Reporter, happened to catch them having a private dinner at a restaurant in Wilmington. Not long after, the newspaper ran a prominent article with the headline, 'Wood and Wagner: When Friendship Steps Outside the Frame.' Robert Wagner read that article in his office in Beverly Hills. He slammed the paper down hard on the floor, poured a full glass of liquor, and muttered angrily, 'Or maybe she no longer belongs to me anymore.' According to his manager at the time, Wagner did not even want to hear anyone in the house mention Christopher Walken's name. Natalie was fully aware of this, but chose not to argue. In a diary discovered many years later, she only wrote briefly, 'Bob is jealous. I'm very tired, but maybe he's just afraid of losing me.' About a week later, Wagner suddenly suggested that the whole family take a vacation. He said he wanted to temporarily get away from Hollywood, but instead of choosing a peaceful place on land, he headed toward the open sea, a place Natalie had always feared since her childhood years. Dennis Davern was asked to prepare the 60-foot yacht, the Splendor, which was moored at Marina del Rey. However, what surprised everyone the most was that Wagner also proactively invited Christopher Walken to join this trip. When Davern expressed his surprise, Wagner only replied coldly, 'I want everything to be made clear.' On the afternoon of November 27, 1981, gray clouds covered the Los Angeles sky. Light rain began to fall. Natalie boarded the boat wearing her familiar cream-colored coat and sunglasses, saying very little. Walken arrived later with a small suitcase, politely greeting everyone. The last to appear was Wagner. In his hand was a bottle of liquor, and his eyes were fixed on the distant horizon. Many years later, when recalling that day, he once said, "I don't know exactly when the wind started to strengthen. I only know that the moment the boat left the dock, a storm had already risen inside me. And that was not just the storm off Catalina Island. It was also the raging tempest that was about to sweep away from his life the most precious things: fame, love, and the last remaining peace." Because just over a day later, when the first glasses of liquor were raised on the waters near Catalina, Robert Wagner's jealousy would begin to push everything into a chain of tragedy from which there would be no way back. "I admit I hid the truth just to avoid trouble, but in the end, I lost myself." Early in the morning of November 29, 1981, the waters around Catalina Island were still crowded with patrol boats. Strong winds whipped across the freezing water, while search teams continued to comb the area around the yacht, the Splendor. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Officer Roger Smith of the Los Angeles Police Department called headquarters to report that they had just found the body of a woman, about a mile and a half from the boat. When the rescue team approached, everyone realized the victim was Natalie Wood. The Hollywood star was floating face down on the sea, her black hair partially covering her face. She wore a red coat over her nightgown and wool socks, an outfit completely out of place in the freezing weather on deck. Right beside her was the dinghy Valiant, its engine off, the key still in the ignition, and the oars securely tied, as if no one had touched them. A young officer present at the scene noted in his report that the scene did not look like an ordinary accident, but rather like something that had been staged. When the investigators boarded the Splendor, Robert Wagner was waiting for them in the main cabin. Despite eyes red from lack of sleep, he maintained an eerily calm composure. According to LAPD documents, Wagner recounted that around midnight, he heard the dinghy banging against the side of the boat. Natalie said she wanted to go out to check the anchor lines because she was worried they might be loose. He thought she had returned to the cabin afterward. It was only the next morning, when he didn't see his wife anywhere, that he felt something was wrong. Wagner's statement was delivered coherently, almost without showing emotion. To many of the young officers involved in the case, he appeared as a grieving husband who still maintained self-control. One person later recalled, "At the time, I felt like he was acting, but his performance was so convincing that no one dared to doubt him." On November 30th, 1981, Police Chief Ronald Brown signed the investigation closure report. The report affirmed that no signs of criminal activity were found. Because all those involved had consumed alcohol on the fateful night, Natalie Wood's death was ruled an accident. Legally, the case was officially closed. However, the real story had not truly ended. Dennis Davern, captain of the Splendor and the last person on board that night, initially stated that after everyone drank, he went to bed early. But many years later, in a conversation with journalist Marty Ransahoff, Davern completely changed his story. He admitted he had not slept at all. According to Davern, he heard Wagner and Natalie arguing fiercely, followed by a loud noise like something being pushed hard, and then everything suddenly fell silent. He said he had remained quiet because he understood Wagner's status and influence in Hollywood. Christopher Walken, the other person on the yacht, chose to avoid mentioning the incident. In his initial statement to police, he only confirmed witnessing the argument between the couple before returning to his own cabin and knowing nothing more. By 1997, when interviewed by Playboy, Walken still maintained the same stance. He regarded it as a tragic accident that he did not want to revisit. The silence of those involved only increased public suspicion, especially when some staff from Doug's Harbor Reef restaurant confirmed that Wagner and Walken had had a heated argument right before returning to the boat. Not long after, the media began dissecting the case. NBC News aired a special program titled The Mystery of Natalie Wood, which quoted statements from Marilyn Wayne and John Payne, the couple sailing near the area at the time. They recounted hearing a woman calling for help 3 times around 11 p.m. Then a man's voice replied, "Okay, honey, we're coming right away." And then everything fell silent. Nevertheless, investigators dismissed this statement due to a lack of evidence proving the woman was Natalie Wood. As doubts continued to rise, Wagner appeared before the public. On December 1st, just 2 days after Natalie's death, People magazine published an exclusive interview portraying him as a husband devastated by loss. In the accompanying photo, Wagner wore a black suit, his eyes red, tightly holding a framed picture of his wife. Journalist Bob Thomas's article was quickly featured on Entertainment Tonight. Millions of viewers watched Wagner share the pain of losing the person he loved. A wave of sympathy spread across America, and Hollywood gradually accepted the view that this was just an accident at sea. However, in the autopsy file, there was still one detail that was almost overlooked. Dr. Michael Franco noted multiple fresh bruises on Natalie's body on her wrists, knees, and forearms. These injuries were not the cause of death, but had formed before she fell into the water. That detail lay dormant in the file for 3 decades, until the case was reopened in 2011. Many years later, Wagner shared, "Everyone said I was too calm, but at that moment I was almost emotionally numb. I didn't dare look at her body. In my mind at the time, I just thought everything had ended." He paused for a very long time before continuing. "I knew I had made up a completely different story from what actually happened. I thought at the time I had no other choice. The whole world was focusing its eyes on me. If I admitted we had argued that night, people would immediately see me as a murderer." A long silence followed. Then Wagner continued in a near whisper, "I lied to protect my image, so Hollywood would still believe I was a strong man. But every time I look in the mirror, I don't see any strength at all. I only see someone trying to run away from himself." From the day Natalie Wood disappeared in the waters off Catalina, what tormented Robert Wagner was not only the unsolved mysteries, it was also the memory of the woman he had never stopped loving, even though she had forever remained beneath those cold waves from that year. That night, jealousy caused me to let reason be clouded. On the evening of November 28, 1981, Avalon Harbor on Catalina Island was brightly lit with early Christmas lights. From the bars along the shore, mellow jazz melodies drifted through the air, creating shimmering golden streaks reflected on the water. In contrast, on the yacht, the Splendor not far away, the atmosphere was extremely stifling, tense as if warning of a major storm about to hit. According to Captain Dennis Davern, from that afternoon, Robert Wagner had already drunk nearly half a bottle of 18-year-old Glenfiddich. He sat silently in the dining cabin, his eyes pensively fixed on the darkening sea in the distance. Natalie Wood wore a white sweater, quietly flipping through the December issue of Harper's Bazaar, which featured an article praising her as a star regaining her form at age 43. On deck, Christopher Walken leaned against the railing, quietly smoking amid the salty mist blowing in from the sea. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but all it needed was a small trigger for everything to shatter instantly. In the evening, the group went ashore for dinner at Doug's Harbor Reef, the famous seafood restaurant that often welcomed Hollywood stars. According to waitress Mary Ellen Whitaker, the atmosphere was initially quite pleasant. They ordered grilled lobster, clam chowder, and 2 bottles of white wine. Natalie chatted more cheerfully than usual. Walken shared about his new film project. Only Wagner remained almost completely silent, occasionally forcing a smile. Paul Anderson, the restaurant cashier, later told police that the situation gradually changed during the meal. He clearly remembered Wagner's eyes staying fixed on Walken, almost without looking away. During the conversation, Walken expressed the view that actors should live for art rather than chase fame. Natalie agreed with that opinion, but those words seemed to hit Wagner's weak spot as he was striving to maintain his position through the Heart to Heart series. He suddenly spoke in a low, deep voice. "Not everyone has the conditions to pursue ideals like that, Chris." The atmosphere around the table immediately became heavy. Natalie gently placed her hand on her husband's shoulder as if to advise him. However, that gesture only made Wagner more uncomfortable. He raised his glass, drank it down, and threw the napkin hard onto the table. The scene happened in a flash, but it was enough for those who witnessed it to remember for many years afterward. In an interview with the Daily Mail, tourist Elaine Rogers recounted that she was sitting at the next table and heard Wagner say in a very irritated tone, "Some people should remember that I am still her husband." Right after that sentence, the space around them fell into almost complete silence. Around 9:30 p.m., dinner ended. When paying, Wagner only briefly told the cashier that he would cover everything and didn't want anyone else to interfere. Natalie said nothing. Her eyes were red from emotion or fatigue. Walken picked up his coat and walked out first, avoiding looking directly at Wagner. Outside the dock, the sea wind blew stronger. There was no rain, but cold, damp air enveloped everything. Davern piloted the small dinghy to bring the group back to the Splendor. Later in ABC News' 2020 program, he recalled that almost no one spoke during the entire journey. There was only the sound of waves hitting the dinghy and Wagner's heavy breathing. Natalie sat at the bow, with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Walken was at the back, smoking while looking out into the night over the sea. Wagner remained silent until they returned to the yacht. As soon as they boarded, he ordered all the main lights turned off, leaving only dim lighting in the dining cabin. Then Wagner poured 3 full glasses of liquor, but the only one who continued drinking was him. Davern recounted that the atmosphere at that time was stifling to the point of being unbearable. Natalie repeatedly begged her husband to stop, but Wagner no longer wanted to listen. He moved close to Walken. At first his voice was low, but it gradually became harsher. "You think you understand her so well? You're interfering in someone else's marriage." Walken stood up. He tried to stay calm and avoid conflict. But Wagner at this point had lost his usual sophisticated appearance. In his rage, he slammed the liquor bottle hard onto the table. The sharp sound of shattering echoed throughout the cabin. Glass shards flew everywhere across the floor. Natalie screamed in panic. "Stop it, Bob!" According to Davern, Walken immediately left the cabin and returned to his room. Natalie stepped back and hurriedly ran out onto the deck. Seeing this, Davern intended to follow her, but Wagner stopped him. Wagner's voice at that moment was not loud, but very heavy. "She needs to be alone." In the LAPD report, Davern later stated that on the table there were still pieces of the broken bottle and a glass with red lipstick marks, the characteristic shade Natalie Wood usually wore when going out. Many years later, in one of his final interviews when recalling that night, Wagner bowed his head for a long time before speaking. "I thought she needed her own space, but the truth is that the person who needed to stay calm at that moment was me." It was a short statement, but also the most painful admission. Because from the moment Wagner chose to sit still instead of going to find Natalie, the mystery of her disappearance began to form. It was followed by decades of conflicting statements, unanswered questions, and secrets he would carry for the rest of his life. "She still comes back on the long nights when I can't sleep." When the 1990s began, Robert Wagner was no longer the shining star he once was. The man who had once walked on glamorous red carpets beside Natalie Wood now lived relatively privately in a Beverly Hills villa, the place that had once contained the happiest years of their lives. Inside that house, everything seemed to have been kept completely unchanged. Old photos still hung all over the walls, Natalie in Rebel Without a Cause, the image of the two standing beside a 1958 Cadillac, or the moment from their second wedding. But for Wagner, they were no longer simply beautiful memories. Each photo became a vivid reminder of a past he had never truly confronted. People working in the house recounted that from the early 1990s, Wagner began to suffer serious sleep problems. Almost every night, around 3 in the morning, the sound of his footsteps would echo down the hallway. The living room light would turn on. Then from afar, they would hear him muttering to himself in a trembling voice, as if talking to someone only he could see. On some nights, Wagner would stand at the window looking out at the lake behind the house and softly call, "Nat, I can still hear you." According to treatment records revealed later, Dr. Leonard Klein, a Los Angeles psychologist specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder, diagnosed Wagner with prolonged PTSD caused by gnawing guilt. In one of his own handwritten notes was the line, "Natalie appeared again. She was soaking wet with seawater and holding a kitchen knife. I woke up, but the smell of salt still clung around me." When these notes leaked, the American media immediately paid strong attention. The Los Angeles Times called it the Catalina Ghost Returning, while People magazine devoted many pages to the life of the man who could not find peaceful sleep after his wife's death. Some experts suggested this was merely the consequence of long-repressed torment. But those close to him had a different view. According to them, what haunted Wagner was not Natalie's spirit, but a conscience that had never been freed. Actress Jill St. John, Wagner's longtime friend, once shared in a 1994 interview that there were nights he would suddenly scream loudly and wake the whole house. She remembered one time Wagner bolted upright in the middle of the night and shouted, "Don't come near me!" When everyone rushed over, he said he had just seen Natalie standing at the foot of the bed. Her hair was soaking wet, her eyes wide open, silently looking at him. Later, Wagner admitted, "I don't believe in ghosts, but every time I close my eyes, I see her emerging from the water. Maybe it's not a ghost. Maybe it's just a memory that refuses to fade." He continued in a tired voice, "I used to love the sea. I thought the sea symbolized freedom. But now it is the place that has buried the rest of my life." Doctors determined that this obsession came not only from the loss, it was also nourished by doubts that never subsided. Throughout the 1990s, American newspapers continuously revived the case. National Enquirer repeatedly reported that police were preparing to reopen the file. The Hollywood Reporter published articles that implicitly suggested Christopher Walken knew more than he had stated. Meanwhile, Natasha Gregson Wagner continued to visit her father regularly. In the 2020 documentary Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, she recounted that every time she entered the study, she would see her father sitting silently in front of a photo of her mother. He would say almost nothing, just sitting and looking. Once Natasha witnessed tears rolling down his face. Wagner softly said, "Dad can still hear Mom calling Dad's name. Maybe she still hasn't forgiven me." No one knew whether that was guilt, hallucination, or punishment from memory. But one thing was clear to everyone. Robert Wagner had never escaped the final night on the yacht, the Splendor. The nightmares continuously tore apart his sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he would see the pitch-black sea, Natalie's wet hair, and hear the waves lapping steadily like the rhythm of his own heart. When he entered his 70s, Wagner almost never left the Beverly Hills villa. According to the housekeeper, every morning he would wipe clean Natalie's framed photo, place a light kiss on the corner, and whisper, "Every night she comes back. In the wind, in the mirror, in the waves. No one else hears it. Only me." After many years of trying to bury the past, Wagner finally decided to do what he believed could bring him peace, rewriting the entire story with his own hands. But the more he wrote, the clearer the memories he thought had been buried deep became. Each page of the manuscript was like a painful excavation right inside his own mind. And when Hollywood read what he left behind, many realized that behind the perfect gentleman image on the silver screen was a man who had not had a single peaceful night's sleep since the winter of 1981. I wrote the memoir hoping for forgiveness, but in the end, I only exposed more of my own mistakes. Nearly 3 decades after Natalie Wood passed away, Robert Wagner returned before the public. This time, he did not appear through a new role or walk the red carpet, but through a book sitting on the shelves of bookstores across America. In September 2008, the memoir Pieces of My Heart, which he wrote with journalist Scott Amon, who had collaborated with John Wayne and Henry Fonda, was published by Random House. On the book cover was a young Wagner with cold blue eyes and a faintly sad smile. But behind that portrait was a much heavier story. Right from the introduction, he described the book as a journey of love, mistakes, memories, and deep longing. Hollywood immediately buzzed. After nearly 40 years of silent avoidance, had the perfect gentleman of the silver screen finally agreed to say what everyone had been waiting for? "I couldn't carry this burden forever," Wagner shared. "I wrote it because I hoped to be forgiven. I loved Natalie in a way that was too selfish. I was jealous, and I was wrong." In the memoir, Wagner devoted hundreds of pages to his childhood, career, and famous friends like Dean Martin, Cary Grant, and Elizabeth Taylor. However, when the story reached the night of November 29, 1981, his pen became vague. He only mentioned that they had been drinking, had argued, and then fate decided the rest. In the chapter dedicated to Natalie, Wagner called her the most beautiful pain in his life. He recounted the morning he had to sign the body identification papers at the Los Angeles coroner's office, saying he didn't dare look at that face because he feared it would reveal what he didn't want to hear. That was one of the rare passages where his writing voice seemed to break, and it was also the part many considered the most authentic. But just 1 week after the book attracted attention, the person who broke the silence was Lana Wood, Natalie's sister. Appearing on CNN's Larry King Live, Lana asserted that Wagner lacked the courage to admit it, but every word in the book sounded like a confession of guilt. Lana particularly pointed out a detail in Chapter 13, where Wagner wrote that he heard a strange sound on the deck, followed by silence. According to Lana, the strange sound was the moment Natalie fell into the sea, and the silence afterward was when Wagner chose to do nothing. After that statement, the media exploded. Wagner, already exhausted after many years of psychological treatment, could not withstand the pressure from public opinion. He canceled all 12 planned book signings in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Dallas. Random House only issued a brief statement that Mr. Wagner needed time to rest. I once thought writing it out would make my heart feel lighter, but every time I reread it, I felt myself being stripped bare another layer. I had opened a door that should have remained locked forever. He continued in a hoarser and heavier voice. I can no longer distinguish what is the truth and what is the lie that I had convinced myself to believe for 40 years. Perhaps I have lived too long inside the story I myself fabricated. Those lines had never been officially released, but when they leaked, the press erupted once again. It was precisely the ambiguous phrases like "strange sound," "fate chose the rest," along with the unprinted confession that caught the attention of the Los Angeles Police Department. In November 2011, nearly 30 years after the Catalina tragedy, LAPD suddenly decided to reopen Natalie Wood's death file. In the statement to the media, they only briefly noted that new information from the memoir and witness statements suggested the incident might not have been a simple accident. From that moment on, Robert Wagner was no longer viewed as the pitiful husband who had lost his wife in the cold sea. In the eyes of the public, he became a suspicious figure in a mysterious case that Hollywood had never truly closed. I don't remember if I pushed her into the water or not, but I know I made her leave me. The small filming room was immersed in near total silence. Dim light fell on the aged face of Robert Wagner, the man once regarded by Hollywood as the model of a perfect gentleman. Now, all that remained in him was a trembling voice, hands that never stopped moving, and a tired posture in front of the camera. He remained silent for a very long time, as if he had to gather all his strength just to begin. In my whole life, there is only one story that I have never told completely, Wagner said slowly. But now, perhaps no one really wants to hear it anymore. The reporter asked if he had ever felt misunderstood. Wagner smiled faintly, a thin and sad smile. His eyes turned toward the window, where the fiery red sunset was covering the wall behind. "No," he replied. "People understand correctly. It's just that I have never said everything." A long silence followed. Then he took a deep breath, his voice becoming hoarser. "I lied to preserve my honor. I once thought the truth could wait. But the truth never stands still, waiting for anyone." The camera captured the moment Wagner closed his eyes. His two fingers gently touched each other, as if groping along each broken piece of memory. That night, I still remember the sound of the wind. She was right there, so close to me. Maybe I said something that made her leave. Maybe I crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed. Then I heard the sound of water, a very soft splash. Even now, I still don't know whether that was her falling or me. Wagner opened his eyes and looked straight into the camera. Many people ask if I have regrets. I don't regret loving Natalie. What I regret is letting anger replace my heart in making decisions. Behind the camera, no one in the crew said a word. They just silently observed him, looking at the eyes that contained something that looked both like fear and relief, as if the man had finally dared to look straight at himself. As the filming session neared its end, Wagner set his cup of tea down on the table. He spoke very softly, almost no longer addressing the reporter, but speaking to his own reflection on the glass. "I did not push her into the water. I only pushed her out of my life. But perhaps, from that moment, I also followed her." After that filming session, Wagner almost disappeared from all cameras. What remained was only the footage, along with the final sentence that closed a long chapter which Hollywood had never had the courage to read to the end. I don't remember if I pushed her into the water or not, but I know I made her leave. More than 4 decades have passed, but the tragedy involving Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner remains one of the most controversial mysteries in Hollywood history. What really happened on the yacht? The splendor on that final night of November 1981 may never be fully clarified, because sometimes The most important clues do not lie in investigation files or public statements, but are hidden in the things that have never been spoken. Until the final years of his life, Robert Wagner still did not provide a full explanation. He maintained complete silence in the face of the most important questions. And it was precisely that prolonged silence, according to many, that made the story even harder to explain than ever. What do you think about this case? In your opinion, was this just a regrettable accident on a night at sea? Or are there truths hidden behind it that have never been revealed? Please leave a comment and share your perspective. If you love mystery stories, sensational cases, and little-known dark corners in Hollywood history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next contents.